Great to be joined again for our look at what's happening in grains and canola by Tess Walsh from Market Check. Tess, how are you going today?
I'm well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you back with us again, and we'll keep things positive if we can, but it is a really heavy time for our grain producers, more so in New South Wales and Victoria than, say, South Australia, but that is a big talking point in the market this week.
Yes, I think everyone is well across the rain that has been falling over all three states really at this point, and more that's been the forecast to come. But what that's really doing to logistics at the moment is quite phenomenal. So we're seeing obviously any old crop that's still moving into domestic homes through Vic and New South Wales really hampered. So for anyone who's got old crop stock with all-weather access, we're seeing some incredible premiums in the market at the moment for that. And then sort of looking forward, that's obviously going to be an ongoing issue coming into harvest. But what it's doing to the spreads, particularly for wheat, is really interesting. So we're seeing APW and better grades really rallying at the moment, and then ASW and below sort of widening and falling against that rising milling grade. Basically, the market's just quite nervous about the lack of milling wheat that's going to be available right across Australia this year.
Yeah, we've heard comments from New South Wales Deputy Premier yesterday on Flow about how the crops are underwater in some parts of regional New South Wales and rotting in the ground. I imagine there'd be some concern now about this record harvest we were heading towards across Australia, but I imagine for South Australian growers it's probably still looking pretty good for a record crop.
Yeah, so obviously there's some growers in South Australia that are fairly ready to start harvest if they haven't already. And this sort of cold weather's just slowing things down. But where we saw some really significant rain, say through the mid-north last week, fortunately those crops were quite a bit later, and they'll still be benefiting from the rain for the most part that we're seeing. But yeah, it's a pretty precarious time, and not a fun one for a lot of people.
No, it's not. We'll switch across to look at the international scene in a minute, but just briefly on the canola side, just looking at the broader graphs for the Kwinana prices, it does appear we're back close to what price levels were around the same time last year, but still a great premium on, say, 2020 and earlier prices.
Yes, canola markets are holding up pretty well. Being very well driven by domestic issues as well. Obviously now most people would be trying to start windrowing, and that's presenting quite an issue through New South Wales for the rain. So from a global front as well, the international canola stock situation is similar to last year, and so we're seeing similar pricing.
And so on that international front, we always talk about the Black Sea. That's one of a number of flashpoints in terms of drivers in pricing at the moment.
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, the ongoing issues through the Black Sea and the conflict that's there are still affecting markets. There's lots of talk about Black Sea grain deal. The 20th of November is the date that's supposed to expire. And the market's fairly well pricing in that Russia isn't going to extend that grain deal in its current form. So there's sort of issues still to play out there. But the flip side of that is that Russia is sitting on a lot of stock, and it's sort of becoming a bearish point. But, because of all this stock, they need to move it, and they also need income. So the price for Russian grain is actually falling, and it's sitting around $20 under French wheat as an equivalent. And they're basically trying to price it to move and incentivize traders to take that risk of owning grain in that region and then exporting it out to keep things moving.
Yeah, great. Well, it's a fascinating point just about that Russian grain. My mind goes back to the Iraq controversy, oil for food and whatever else. And then I think there was talk of boycotting Russian product, but in the end, it's probably better that it's used than not used at all for the sake of feeding the people around the world.
That's right. I mean, there's many other things that the world can do to punish Russia, I suppose. But by boycotting food, the people that are going to lose are the people that most need that food, and sort of more the developing countries. And I think it's sort of off the table as a measure going forward.
And looking further afield than the Black Sea, is there some other market movements in the Americas, for instance, worth picking up on at the moment?
There's been some sort of dry weather around the US that's made the news this week, but probably the biggest point over that part of the world is Argentina. Their crops going backwards at a rate of knots. I think they're down to about 13 million tonnes as their production estimate for wheat, and it sort of came off from about 20. Basically, very, very dry over there, and reflecting with those updated estimates. But the other probably talking point worth mentioning is India. So India's domestic wheat stockpile has been reported to be at 5-year lows. And they've recently tried to buy a bit, but only sort of achieved half of what they were hoping to. So it's expected that we will see India in the market over the next few months, which really helps from a demand point of view.
Yeah, it certainly does. At the end of we're almost at 8 billion people in the world, I think. The demand side is always going to be a constant. It's just a matter of how much people are producing. In Australia, despite flooding conditions, we're still going to be producing a fair bit this harvest.
And that's it. I mean, it's not so much the volume that's going to be affected in Australia. It's the quality, unfortunately. And anyone who can, produce reasonable quality grain, I think will be paid quite fairly for it this year.
Well, that's good news. A good way to finish our chat with you. Tess Walsh from Market Check. Thanks for filling us in on the grains and canola markets this week here on Flow.
My pleasure. Thanks, Ricky.